Hey everybody, and welcome back to Ready Steady Play, where I'm going to show you Siege mode for Siege Storm. So now you can play with your friend against an AI, or solo against an AI, in a Siege mode, which is the actual Siege of Siege Storm. This is a prototype version, so bear in mind some of this stuff isn't final, but it's a good indication, and I'll show you how it works, so you can decide whether it's something you're interested in. In this particular version of Siege mode, we are sieging Bylos the Goblin King. So here in the box, we've got a hit point tracker. This will track Bylos's hit points. He starts with different amounts depending on how many players you have, etc. I've also got here a deck of Goblin cards. I've got here a deck of Shaman cards, which are other kinds of minions for Bylos. I also have here some advanced Goblin cards. These are used when you play on harder difficulties. And we have the same here, advanced Shaman cards. I've got 3 Bylos cards. They are different difficulty levels. You can see the difficulty level down here. And then some rules addendums here as well. Mostly the same, but we'll look at that in a minute. I also have 2 of these ground boards. Now, if you've played the competitive mode, you'll be familiar with these 3 cards here. And this is just a sort of cardboard put together version of that. So we've got 2 of those. You'll only need 1 if you're playing on your own, but you'll need 2 if you're playing with a friend. So we've got 2 of those. We have here a boss board as well. This is used to track what boss we're fighting against, and also the Menace level. And more on that later. There's also a handy player reference here on the side of it. Finally, I've got Goblin tokens, I've got Spirit tokens, and I've got a little Menace tracker token here as well that I'm going to put down here on the boss board to track the Menace level. So I'm going to set up my boss board up here. So I'm going to set aside all of these cards for now, these 4 decks, and careful not to mix them up because I'm going to need them in a minute. Then I'm going to select my Bylos card. Now in this case I'm going to take the level 1 card. We'll set up the easiest difficulty, but you can of course escalate as you want. In the rules they're described as piece of cake, and then nightmarish and pure hell, something like that. It is a significant escalation. And then if I was playing on my own, I would set up just one of these ground boards here like this, and I would choose to take one of the decks from the Siege Storm game. And you can play with whichever deck you want. You can be Seraphia, you can be Styxia. If you have more factions, you can choose those. You can play with the starter decks that I've got here, or you can play with your own deck that you've built. Remember, the rules for deck building are 34 cards, 4 of each type, so you can go in with whatever you want, whatever you think is going to give you the best chance of defeating Bylos. So I've got my level 1 Bylos card. I'm going to put him down here. And if I'm playing with 2 players, I'll take a second ground board and I'll put it here. And I'm going to set up a 2-player game here, but that's the only real difference, that I'm setting up 2-player boards like that. There are 2 ways to win this game. Now, note that the first victory condition is a victory condition that applies to all bosses, which is survive the entire siege deck. Much like in the competitive version, if Bylos ever goes to draw cards from his deck and he's run out of cards, he's run out of resources and he loses the siege. The second victory condition for Bylos is to reduce him to 0 hit points. As you can see here on his boss card, we have victory conditions here, and it says when Bylos has received 25 damage or 60 damage if there are 2 players. So 1 player 25 damage, 2 players 60 damage. So I'll take this health meter and I'll set it to 60. This is used to track the amount of damage he's taken. I would set it to 25 if I were playing by myself. Now the next thing I'm going to do is assemble his siege deck. And I'm going to do that by looking at the back of his boss card here. There's a bunch of stats here, so I'll show you what they mean. So we've got 2 columns here, one for solo mode and one for co-op mode. The deck will be a bit more difficult on co-op mode, but there's 2 of you, so you should be fine. The first row here is Goblin cards. So I'll find that Goblin deck from earlier, which is this one here, and I'll take out 15 Goblin cards, 10 if I was on my own. The second in the column here is Shaman cards. So I'll find that Shaman deck, and I'll add 15 of these cards. Now there should be 20 of each type here so that you can so that you can have some replayability unless you're playing on level 3. Level 3 Bylos uses all 20 cards, which is a lot. He also has 8 special cards, which is like all of them, which is insane. We've got 3 more stats down here, which you just heard me talking about. We've got special cards. These are the cards that I would draw from these special decks. I would do it randomly so I could shuffle them together and just deal out a few, so I didn't know which ones I have. But he's got 0 on the level 1 difficulty, so we don't have to worry about that. This down here is his hand size, so he's going to have a hand size of 3 for this game. Again, this differs if you're playing on solo. And he's going to start with a Menace level of 2. So I'm going to set his Menace level here to 2. I'm going to take his Siege deck and I'm going to give it a good shuffle. So the Menace level is kind of like an abstract gauge. It's used for different things. It determines how strong, generally speaking, we actually want the Menace level to be higher. You see, you remember supporters? How you can have mana cards that support you in the cooperative game? Well, you're gated in the cooperative version, the solo version. You remember the supporters who act as mana in the competitive game? Well, in the cooperative game, you're gated by the Menace level. So at Menace level 2, you can only have 2 supporters. If it ever drops to 1 and you have 2 supporters, you have to sacrifice 1 immediately to your casualties pile. So having a Menace level of 5 means we can have 5 supporters, which is pretty good. But that Menace level is going to go up and down during the course of the game. Typically, things we do that injure Bylos will reduce the Menace level, and things that he does, in this case Siege, will increase in this case Storm with his monsters will increase the Menace level. So his deck will go up here. Then our players will shuffle their decks and set them up. Remember, you can draw your 2 cards, you can check them out, you can mulligan them if you don't like them and draw 2 new ones. And there we go, we're ready to play the cooperative version of Siege Storm, Siege mode. The boss goes first. The boss always goes first. So we can see from this handy player aid here, the attack and defense phases. The attack phase is essentially the boss's turn, and the defense phase is essentially the player's turn. You can ignore these first 2 steps on the first round of the game. They won't take place because the boss won't have any cards on the table. However, these steps will come into play later. The third step is draw cards. This is where the boss will draw a hand of cards, and then actions where he will do things with that hand of cards, and finally a final turn where he will discard those cards to a backup pile. I'll talk more about the 5th phase later on. Then we have our turn, which works almost exactly like the competitive mode, and then it's back to the boss's turn. So the first thing he'll do on the first turn is draw cards, so let's go straight to the draw phase. So I'm going to draw 3 cards off the top of Bylos's deck here and put them out. So I've got a monster there, a spiritual shaman. I've got another monster, a goblin tank. And I've got what is essentially a support card, a goblin leader. When I'm looking at these cards, primarily what I want to be looking at is this symbol here. This is the shaman attack symbol, this is the goblin attack symbol, and this is a support symbol. There are actually 3 support symbols in this deck. The other ones might appear like this, which is a totem symbol. Totems go onto the ground board and provide support for the boss. Or like this, which is the spirit symbol and special action symbol, which refers to this down here. So the first thing that's going to trigger on the boss's turn is he's going to deploy a creature to the track. His track is in the middle here, while our players will use the tracks on the outside, just like in the competitive mode, with cards progressing down through no man's land to the front line. When they move off the end of the track, they'll storm, hold, or become support. It works a little differently for Bylos. He doesn't hold or become support, he just storms, but he will also gain cards on these ground boards as well. So what's going to happen is that we're going to look at these 2 creatures here. Now this is the attack symbol for the shaman, and this is the attack symbol for the goblin deck. Remember, we've got 2 different decks here, or 2 different card types here. And both of these cards can be deployed here to the track, which we know because of these symbols. However, the spiritual shaman will be deployed because he is more expensive than the goblin tank. Then we would deploy any support to the ground boards. Support have this shield icon in the goblin deck and the totem icon in the shaman deck. So here we have an example of a totem with the totem icon here, and here's the goblin leader from Bylos's hand with the goblin support symbol there. So in this case, the goblin leader is going to move down to the track. Now, Bylos can fill No Man's Land as well. It's a contested spot, just like in the competitive version. So he's going to go ahead and put the Goblin Leader down here into No Man's Land. The players can decide where this card goes, although he'll fill up No Man's Land before filling up the front line. This is going to sit there, giving a passive bonus to his creatures. In this case, it's going to put a Screaming Goblin face on any creature deployed. The Goblin Leader has a passive ability that gives out Goblin face tokens onto creatures when they're deployed to the track, and when this happens, their attack value is increased for every token on them. There are other horrifying ways to get those tokens onto creatures, but don't worry about that for now. That's how the Goblin Screamy faces work. This card here can't do anything, so it's just going to sit there doing nothing for the time being. And with that, it's actually over to our player's turn, which they're going to play just like the competitive mode, except with the difference that they play simultaneously. So you're going to go through the phases together. You start with Prepare, where you untap your support. Then you go to Draw, where you draw 2 cards to make up your starting hand of 4 cards. And then you're going to move on to the track movement. There's no one on the track to move. Then we're going to be able to deploy cards to the track, just like in the competitive mode. And you want to coordinate with your partner here. Now, one of the cool things about the competitive mode, the cooperative mode, that you don't get in the solo mode because you're playing by yourself, is that the passive abilities of your creatures here on the track and that are deployed here onto the ground boards affect both players. In this case, I have the old Paladin card, and he has this passive ability. You can spend a mana to draw a card. Any of us can do that, so my partner in the co-op version could spend a mana to draw a card as well, so long as the old Paladin's passive ability is available. However, you cannot use actions on one another, so if I played the old Paladin for his heal action, I could not heal my cooperative partner. However, if there was a passive ability that allowed you to pay for healing, they could use that ability to heal themselves instead. Note that negative effects like this Fire Elemental's passive ability will affect the other player as well, so you really need to talk about this and coordinate it as you move through the game. Once the players are done, play moves back to Bylos. Now, this time he's got some stuff going on, so the first thing he does is discard. Note that when he discards cards from his hand, they're put in what's called a backup pile, and not in his casualties pile. This means that when he exhausts his siege deck, he will shuffle his backup pile to reform it. So unless you can move these cards to his casualties pile, he'll continue to refresh his siege storm, his resources deck here, and you won't be able to defeat him by exhausting those cards. Don't worry, we'll talk about how to get cards into the casualties pile in a minute. He's also going to move this Spiritual Shaman down the track. That's his next step, and then it's back to drawing his hand of cards. So here we've got a totem of destruction. We've also got a Goblin Killer and a Seal of Madness. The very first thing that happens is he deploys the Goblin Killer to his track down here. Now, the Goblin Killer is the one that's deployed because it's the only one with the attack symbol. Remember, we're either looking for that, or we're looking for the double swords on the Shaman cards here. So the Goblin Killer is deployed to the track. The next thing that happens is that any totems are moved into the ground board. So we'll put this into No Man's Land. Finally, the Seal of Madness is going to trigger. Now, this has a wolf symbol on it. It's also got this action symbol here. The first thing that triggers is this wolf symbol, which means we apply spirit tokens to all of the totems. It just so happens that we've now got a totem on the board which has just come out. So I'm going to take one of these spirit tokens and put it down on the destruction totem. Whenever a token is added to a totem, it triggers its special ability. Some special abilities require more tokens to trigger, but in this case, we only need one spirit token and it will trigger 1 damage to each player. If I put down another token here, then each player will take 2 damage, and these will continue to stack, getting worse and worse until someone destroys this. This can only be destroyed by a storming card. Just like in the competitive mode, the only way to kill this is to deal it damage with a card that storms off the end of the track. If you remember from my description of the competitive game, when players take damage, they just put the top card of their deck into their casualties pile. Now, the last thing that happens is that the Seal of Madness triggers its active ability. So now that we've resolved the spirit symbol, we resolve the active ability, which says each opponent discards 2 cards. So that just means each player must discard 2 cards from hand. If they don't have those cards in hand, then whoopee, they don't have to discard anything. And with that, we move on to the player's turn. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you an example of Bylos storming, it's actually very much similar to the way players storm as well. In this case, we've got the Spiritual Shaman here, and he's going to move off the edge of the board. And when he does that, we compare his strength to the defense of the two creatures in the deployment zone of the players. When a creature moves off of the end of Bylos's track, it always storms. And when it storms, we check damage. In this case, the Old Paladin defends the 2 damage from the Spiritual Shaman, but the Fire Elemental has a defense of 0, so the Shaman will do 2 damage. Now, note that the Shaman will always attack characters on the ground board first. So if our Styxia player here had any characters that they'd put on their front line or here in the No Man's Land area that could be killed with 2 damage, then they will be killed by the Spiritual Shaman and move to the casualties pile. However, if there are no cards there for him to kill, or he's unable to kill the cards because he doesn't have enough damage, then the damage will be dealt directly to the Styxia player and they'll take 2 damage instead. Just like in the competitive mode, just like when your cards are storming, of course you also check the creature's ability. A lot of Bylos's creatures don't have abilities, so you can just ignore that. However, if they do have an ability, this also takes effect, so the Spiritual Shaman will do damage, and then also take all the seal cards in Bylos's casualties pile and shuffle them back into his resources. After we've finished resolving the Spiritual Shaman's storm, the Shaman goes into the casualties pile, and the Menace level is increased by 1. That is the method by which Bylos increases his Menace track. How do we damage Bylos? Well, as our cards move down this track, it's going to be just the same as competitive mode pretty much. When the Old Paladin moves off the end, the first thing he's going to do is try and do damage. He has an attack of 1. The defense here of the Goblin Killer is 0. So yes, we do check the defense of the creature in Bylos's deployment area. This means that the Old Paladin can do 1 damage. That's not enough to take out the Destruction Totem or the Goblin Leader, but I can do a damage to Bylos. When Bylos takes damage, the first thing that happens is any cards left in his hand are put in his casualties pile. Note that this is distinct from the backup pile, and that's all of the Old Paladin's damage because he only does 1. However, if he did more damage, any excess damage would then be dealt straight to Bylos's hit points here on this tracker. Remember, if we get these 60 hit points to 0, then we win. And then the Old Paladin, of course, after resolving the storm, goes into the casualties pile. So now Bylos has got 2 cards in his casualties pile. He's got the Spiritual Shaman and the Seal of Madness. If he ever heals, he takes these cards and puts them back on the bottom of the siege deck, which is bad because that means they're going to come back around and haunt us. Remember, if this deck exhausts, we take the backup cards here, shuffle, and reform it. So the only way to actually exhaust this deck is to make sure these cards go into the casualties pile. And the only way to get them in the casualties pile is either if the card storms, which we don't want because it triggers the card's ability and also does damage. We'd much prefer to deal damage to Bylos directly and put the cards from his hand, the leftover cards from his hand, into the casualties pile that way. And then we can also, if we free up his hand there, we can also then do damage to him and reduce his hit points on the siege meter. Remember, both are victory conditions. It's quite hard to focus one and not the other because you have to deal with the cards in his hand, which are sort of soaking damage, before you can start doing damage to the siege meter anyway. If Bylos ever defeats one of the players, i.e. the player runs out of cards in their resource deck, and they go to draw and cannot draw anymore, that player is out of the game. All of their cards are removed to their casualties pile, and they sit this one out for the remainder of the game. The other player can continue playing, trying to win, and hopefully they'll have better luck. There are a few other elements. If Bylos ever has to choose to discard anything or do anything negative, start with the lowest cost cards. If he ever wants to do anything good that will benefit with him, he'll play the highest cost cards. If anything ever refers to Bylos's supporters, i.e. this deals damage equal to the number of supporters, then you use the Menace level. If it kills his supporters, no matter how many supporters it kills, then you just reduce the Menace level by 1. If he ever has to discard cards, he discards the cards from here. If there are no cards here, then he cannot discard any cards. Cards that are discarded are put into the casualties pile and not the backup pile. The backup pile is only refilled by cards that he discards at the beginning of his turn, i.e. cards that have remained here that haven't been put into the casualties pile from damage. If 2 cards have the same cost, then the players determine which card to put out. Note that unlike in the competitive version, the current rule is that you cannot play cards during Bylos's turn, so you can't jump in with an action on Bylos's turn to make him discard cards or kill off creatures or anything like that. I know that that rule has been much debated during the playing of this game, so it may be subject to change later, but at the moment that's the ruling, is that you cannot play your action cards on Bylos's turn, which is different in the competitive mode. And I think that pretty much just about covers it for Siege mode of Siege Storm. But if you want to see this in action, Barry and I are going to play on the channel Ready Steady Play. The video might be up here too, so please do come and check that out and join us for that game, where we will be taking on Bylos on Piece of Cake mode, because we don't want to embarrass ourselves on the internet by losing. I hope this has helped you understand how the cooperative mode works, and whether or not you want to get involved in this Kickstarter. There is a lot on offer. So, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.